Hello everyone and welcome to Unit 6. For this unit we're going to focus on learning. Now when I looked up the definition of learning online, I wanted to see how does it compare to our textbook definition. It's the process of acquiring new understanding, knowledge, behaviors, skills, values, attitudes, and preferences. So I want to keep that in mind as we go through this unit, that learning is not just what we think about it in an academic sense. Learning happens all around us all the time. And so you learn in multiple scenarios, as you will see with classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and modeling and learning through like our social models, observational learning. Thank you, brain, gave it to me. So we're keep that in mind as we go through. I want to demonstrate how learning occurs in multiple settings, not just the classroom. So what we're going to talk about with this first part is I'm going to try to separate these videos. There's one part classical conditioning, the other part operant and observational learning. With classical conditioning, we're going to distinguish between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Okay? These are both learning through associations. But classical conditioning is learning through associating stimuli. Okay? And operant conditioning is associating a stimuli with an important event. Such as a reward. That's a type of operant conditioning. So associating through like consequences. We're going to understand some important facts about each and tell us how they work. We're going to understand the foundations, and I'm going to give you a little like formula for how to work them. Understand how they work together to influence human behavior as well as separately, because sometimes classical conditioning and operant conditioning build on one another. And list the 4 aspects of observational learning. So we're going to talk a bit about social learning theory, but that one's a little easier than classical conditioning. So let's do classical, then operant, then social learning theory. So with behaviorism, if you remember, this is the perspective in psychology that focuses on behavior. This is the idea that we had to be more objective in our scientific approach, and we couldn't really bother ourselves with what was going on in the brain. We just had to look at how people's behavior was reflected as a result of their learning. Because learning, what's important about learning is acquiring this information, but also having an opportunity to demonstrate the learning. So classical conditioning was started by Ivan Pavlov. Now he was a physiologist. He was not a psychologist, so just an important thing to note. And operant condition is largely attributed to B.F. Skinner, which you're going to read in your text. And we're going to learn to differentiate those two. So let's start with classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is associating through 2 stimuli. So for example, if you saw these 2 police officers, all right, and you saw this officer standing there with that, what appears to be a radar gun, like a speed gun or whatever they call them, and you were driving down the road, think about how you would feel. Think about what you would do, right? Do you slow down when you see that? That's a result of classical conditioning. You've learned to associate that radar gun with slowing down. Because of a whole slew of factors. Well, classical conditioning is, we are scared of the ramifications, which may be more operant conditioning, but we learn that, when you see a police officer standing there with a speed gun, that you slow down. That is a part of classical conditioning, and this occurs in all facets of your life. Think of any smell that you've smelled. Olfactory senses are amazing. Think of any cologne that you've smelled, and it reminds you of an ex-lover or something, or an ex-partner, right? That is classical conditioning. You've learned to associate that smell with that person, and sometimes it makes you cringe, and you're like, oh, or you hear a song that reminds you of an ex, right? That's all classical conditioning. You've learned to associate those things with something else. And so what we're going to look at, we're going to break down these components. Now, maybe it'd be best if I got my little whiteboard up to show you, but I do have a clip. So Pavlov did an experiment where he was collecting saliva from dogs, okay? And he wanted to see how much they salivated based on the food that they were given. So he would ring a bell to go into the room, give the dogs the food, he'd watch the dogs salivate, collect the saliva, and continue. Well, eventually he noticed that the dogs were salivating at the sound of the bell as opposed to the sight of the food. They didn't see the food yet and they were salivating. So Pavlov's like, what is this? Why are they salivating before they even see the food? Well, they've learned to associate the bell with the food. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Conditioned stimulus, conditioned response. Now in this scenario, and I have a bunch of practice questions for you to do. If you feel so inclined, they're at the end of the PowerPoint. I'll show you. So originally, we have an unconditioned stimulus. Now think of that as unlearned. This is your natural response to seeing that thing. So our unconditioned stimulus for these dogs is meat, all right, or the food, right? That unconditioned stimulus, they don't learn like, oh, that's food, I'm going to salivate. It's a response. They see food and their response is to salivate. No learning has occurred. This is just what happens, right? But after so many trials of pairing the bell with the food, ringing the bell and showing the food, that unconditioned response of salivating is now going to be attributed to the conditioned stimulus, which is the bell. Conditioned meaning learned. So eventually, that learned stimuli, that learned stimulus is going to elicit a learned response. They've learned that the bell means food is coming, and so you're going to have a conditioned response. Now, please note that I also introduced in your assignment what's called a neutral stimulus. That's what you call a stimulus that produces no effect. Okay, it's just introduced into the equation. In this case, the bell starts as neutral. It doesn't affect the dog in any way. It's just kind of there. But after so many pairings, it's not neutral anymore because it has been learned to be associated with food. I hope I'm making sense because this is kind of confusing. So make sure you are reading your text to catch up, stay caught up. And so eventually you learn to associate that bell with the food. So one thing I want you to note, the neutral stimulus, when you're breaking down these problems, the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are always the same thing. They're the same stimulus. It's just one, the stimulus without learning and then with learning. The unconditioned response and the conditioned response are always the same thing. See, salivating and salivating. They are just to different stimuli. So you see the salivation when it's learned is now associated with a bell, whereas when it was unlearned it was associated with meat. Okay? Now let me go back to these fundamentals. An unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that elicits a particular response without prior learning. We said that. Unconditioned response, the same thing. The stimulus is what's going to stimulate or provoke a response. So the response depends on the stimulus. So for our ad assignment, for example, when we're looking at those advertisements, let's say you pick a celebrity in an ad. There is a reason we pay celebrities to hawk our products, right? They want us to take the unconditioned stimulus of Kylie Jenner. Okay? And there's some learning that had occurred previously, but for the sake of our example, Kylie Jenner, we have different associations we have about her. Love her or hate her. She's a very famous, prominent, influential figure. So the unconditioned stimulus is Kylie Jenner. What she is selling is the neutral stimulus. We don't know anything about hair gummy vitamins or detox teas. We know nothing about them. But if they show them enough with her in the commercial, the feelings that we have toward Kylie Jenner, or the unconditioned response, they're hoping that those same feelings will feel towards the product. So same thing with Michael Jordan and his Fruit of the Loom undies. All right? Same thing with Drake and his Sprite commercial. They're hoping that those marketing agencies are hoping will associate that product with that person so we feel the same way about the person as we do the product. That's classical conditioning in a nutshell. So how many times do we pair stimulus? So when we talk about the cologne example, let's say you have an ex-lover who always wore Axe body spray. Maybe you go, ooh, right? Right? The unconditioned stimulus is the spray. It has an aroma, and you have an unconditioned response, which is just like, oh, smell it, it smells good. Well, eventually, let's say you're still with this person. Maybe we'll make it happy. You're still with this person. And so that person has worn that cologne enough times that they have been associated with that cologne, right? And so that person can elicit the same feelings you feel towards that cologne. Maybe you really like the cologne and the person wore it because they knew you liked it. That's the sort of classical conditioning. They want you to associate them and the feelings you have towards them with the feelings they have toward the cologne. And this is just a demonstration of, I talked about this, but I think the visual will help for some people. So unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Neutral stimulus. You see how with that dog picture, the dog's just like, okay, it's a bell. Third, multiple pairings. That's what that plus sign means. Ring the bell plus the food yields salivation. And fourth, just the bell alone will yield salivation. Very important. Here's a video of classical conditioning in pop culture. I love Frasier. It's one of my favorite shows, so that's why I use this. But there's also a scene from The Office where, what's his face? Jim, I don't know The Office. Jim conditions Dwight with Altoid mints. That's another example of classical conditioning. So make sure you can kind of break those down. This video is a study of little Albert. So John Watson was another behaviorist, and his research assistant, Rosalie Rayner, before they were banished from psychology for having, like, a love affair, John Watson eventually did, like, marketing. So that's why all these classical conditioning components relate so much to marketing. They conditioned a child to be scared of a rat. So what they did was the unconditioned stimulus of a gong, okay? So they rang like a gong or a large, like, cymbal type thing and scared 9-month-old baby Albert, all right? And then eventually they showed him a rat, and he loved the rat. He was playing with it. He loved it. But eventually they would slam the cymbal as they showed Albert the rat. So eventually Albert learned to associate the rat with the loud noise and the scariness. So he didn't like the rats anymore. And this went on to other things that were white and fuzzy. So other small mammals, as well as a Santa mask. And this gets to our next point of stimulus discrimination versus generalization. Stimulus discrimination is this idea that only specific stimuli can elicit a conditioned response. So with little Albert, he started being scared of more things that resembled a rat. That's generalization. Related stimuli, it's fuzzy, it's white, it's scary. It's kind of branching out to cover different stimuli. Stimulus discrimination is only a specific stimuli can elicit that response. So maybe he was only scared of rats. Maybe rats of different colors, but it's still only that type of rat. That's discrimination. Another example of a small child gets bit by a large black dog. Okay? Discrimination, stimulus discrimination would say only black dogs elicit fear in the child, or only large dogs elicit fear in the child. Generalization would say all dogs elicit that fear response in the child. So that's the difference between discrimination and generalization. Now, one thing I want you to think about as we wrap up this video is what examples of classical conditioning can you think of from your own life experiences? Like, as we talk about scents that trigger a certain memory, how can you break those down? Maybe what's the last commercial you saw? How can you break down that commercial for our advertising assignment? Think about it. Reflect on the material. And let me know if you have any questions. Yeah, I'm going to stop it there. Stay tuned for part 2.